Endurance Junkie podcast, episode 110. Hey Junkies, what's up? I hope everybody has had an awesome weekend. My name is Peter, and thanks for joining me on a new episode of the Endurance Junkie podcast, the show where I will be interviewing some of the fastest, smartest, and most inspiring people active in the endurance world today. Now, if you like these little interviews and don't want to miss any future ones, just head over to iTunes or Stitcher and simply subscribe to the show to automatically receive the latest episode directly on your computer or your mobile device. Show's also on Spotify, so if that's your preferred medium, just search for Endurance Junkie Podcast in the search bar and you will find me no problem. Also, feel free to join me on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter if you want to discuss or leave your comments. My handle is Junkie Podcast on all platforms, so it should be nice and easy for us to connect. Now, Alex Hutchinson competed as a middle and long distance runner for the Canadian national team for more than 10 years. Today he's a columnist at Outside Magazine, and he writes the Sweat Science blog about the science of endurance sports. His new book, Endure, Mind, Body and the Curiously Elastic Limits of Human Performance, explores human endurance performance limits and how to push them further and further. So hi Alex, thanks for coming on the show. Now, for those of us who don't know you, can you maybe start off by telling us a bit about yourself and your own sporting background growing up?
Sure. Well, so right now, I guess I would call myself a science journalist or even an endurance science journalist, since that's what I seem to mostly write about. But that definitely comes from my experiences in sport. I was a runner. I am a runner, I guess, but I've been a runner since I was in school and competed mostly initially as a middle distance runner. I was a 1,500 meter guy, but I also ran cross country and eventually moved up and ran some 5Ks and ended up doing some mountain running. I ended up competing for the Canadian team in track and cross country at the World Cross Country Championships and some road running stuff, and also at the World Mountain Running Championships. So basically, if it's a running race, I was interested in doing it. And I did that pretty seriously until my late 20s or early 30s. And the other bit of my background is that I worked as a physicist initially. I did a PhD and some postdoctoral research in physics, but it didn't quite catch my passion. So in my late 20s, I kind of shifted from doing physics and running to doing journalism, and ended up. I started out working for a newspaper and then went freelance and started writing about sports because that's what I was interested in endurance sports, but not so much about, who's winning and who's losing, but more about why and how. And that's been about a little more than a decade now. I guess about 2006 is when I started freelancing, and I've been writing mostly about the science of endurance sports since then.
Okay. So yeah, you competed for Team Canada as a runner. Were you just not good enough to compete at the elite world-class level, or would you sum up your career as a runner? Yeah,
so I mean, and in a sense, some of my interest, I think, in the science of endurance and the limits of endurance comes from wondering whether I could have been better, why I wasn't better. I ended up running probably my best performance. I ran 1,500 in 3:42, which is right around a 4-minute mile equivalent. I ran 13:52 for 5K. Could I have gotten better? I would say I stuck with the sport longer than a lot of my peers who, I competed seriously till I was 28, and that was in 2004. I had a stress fracture in my sacrum about 3 months. I think everyone says this, but I was in, I think, the shape of my life in 2004, but I got a stress fracture in my lower back 3 months before the Olympic trials. And at that point I decided it had been, of the previous 8 years, I'd had one healthy season. I'd been injured for some significant fraction of 7 of the previous 8 years. So, I definitely think I could have gone faster than I ran. maybe run 3:39 or something like that, or 13:35 or something like that. But that's still not Olympic level, right? Like you have to run 3:36 or 13:20 to get to the Olympics. And I don't know if I could have got there. Like but I tried everything I could to get there in terms of training and staying healthy. So it's what would have happened in an alternate universe if I hadn't got a stress fracture or if things had gone differently. I don't know, but I feel like within my within my ability to live going forward rather than with hindsight, I did everything I could to get to the Olympic level, and I didn't make it.
Do you think were you able to figure out afterwards like what was wrong that you only had like one healthy season out of the last 8 that you talked about?
Yeah, it is interesting because obviously, as I was saying, I've spent the last like 10 or 12 years writing about the science of performance and looking into, in a much deeper way than I ever did when I was actually competing. And so, are there some insights that I have now that I didn't have then? Definitely. There's some things I would do differently, maybe even including things like, shoe choice and the shoes I ran in, and the maybe working differently on my running form. But it is interesting. It's always, sometimes when you learn new things, you kind of tend to forget how much you did know in the past. And so sometimes I look back and say, well, I look back at my training logs and wonder what I would have done differently. And I look back and realize, okay, I was actually doing things reasonably well. Like, when I got my first injury when I was 21, my first serious injury shortly after running 3:42, which ended up being my all-time best performance, I think. I had a pretty bad case of runner's knee that kept me out for almost 2 years, really. And you look back at my training log, and I was a relatively low mileage runner. I was running 60, 70, at most 80K a week when I ran some of my best times. And I knew that if I wanted to be world class, I needed to run more mileage. But I also knew that if I decided to go from 80K to 120K in the course of a year, I'd probably get hurt. So I was very cautious, just gradually moving up to 90K, moving up, all the sort of usual stuff, most 10% changes, and then with down weeks every 3 or 4 weeks. And the fact is, I got up to 100K for like the first time in my life, and I got hurt, and I'd only done a couple of weeks. So it's not like I look back and it's like, boy, Alex, you're a moron. You tried to double your mileage in a week. I was doing things pretty carefully. And so, I again, like I said, if I had like 10 parallel lives that I could try slightly different things, I don't know whether in one of them I would have been more successful over a runner, or in 9 of them I would have been more successful, because it's not like, and this is a theme that I think is important to when we talk about the limits of endurance, it's not like there's like, oh, you didn't realize you have to do this exercise or take this supplement or do this workout, and then everything's going to be easy or different. It's all like marginal, small differences. And if you're trying to push your limits, the inevitable truth is it's always a high risk game. You're always facing the risk of injury or of just like not quite getting things right, not peaking at the right time. Like, it's not a science, it's an art. And we see the people who succeed at the Olympics, and it's tempting sometimes to think, well, they know all the answers and they got there because they know everything and did everything perfectly. Well, maybe, but maybe there were also 100 people exactly like them, and 99 of them didn't make it, and one of them did because they happened to get things right and they got a little bit lucky, as well as being extremely talented and hardworking.
Okay. So were you coached at that time, or were you figuring everything out by yourself?
Yeah, I had a number of very good coaches. I was moving around for my education, and so I had different coaches in different places. When I did my grad school in England, I was 3 years in England, and the coach I worked with there was a guy named Harry Wilson, who's a very well-known coach. He had coached Steve Ovett to the world record in the mile, and he coached a few people in England, and he would drive around and come just supervise your workouts individually. So I had a very good coach who was thinking very carefully about my workouts there. And after that, a few years later, when I was healthy again, I was living in the United States, and I was training with Matt Centrowitz Sr., who was a former American record holder in the 5,000 and the father of the current Olympic 1,500 champion. And again, he's a very, very insightful and intuitive coach. And I tried to follow his advice, but it wasn't always, I wasn't able to stay healthy for long, for long enough stretches of time. And each season, each year, you learn something new. And in my years with Centro, where I would say I was in the best shape of my life, I would get really fit coming through the winter and spring, doing a lot of base work, not too high intensity. And as we started to transition to track season, where it was time to really start going, I would start doing some faster workouts. And I had some weaknesses that I didn't quite manage to address. And I would get hurt sort of after my first or second race each year, starting to get excited and do some faster workouts. And I would hurt something. And so each year I would say, okay, next year I need to learn not to make that mistake. And so I would fix that mistake, and then I would make another mistake 2 weeks later. And at a certain point, I ran out of years. And, maybe if I'd started with Centro when I was 19 instead of when I was 24, I would have managed to sort of put all the pieces together in my mid-20s. But I got to 28, and it's like, well, I've given it the number of shots that I can, and I need to start thinking about my career, because as a 28-year-old 342 guy, the future is not necessarily all that bright.
Yeah. Okay. Moving on then to that career as a journalist. I think you wrote for Runner's World, and I think a lot of people know you now as the author of Sweat Science in Outside Magazine. How did you land that gig, and what are you trying to get across there?
Yeah, it was when I decided to go into journalism, I had this sort of vaguely formed idea that it would be fun to be able to just spend my time writing about stuff that I thought was really cool and that I was interested in. And so I had this vague idea that that's the kind of thing I would like to do. And specifically writing about the science of exercise was just, given my science background, I don't write about physics or anything. So it's not like I need to know Newton's laws to write about, ice baths or whatever. But I can use that science background to just, I have a comfort talking to scientists, reading scientific journals, and, not being put off by equations and complicated journal articles. So I kind of figured that was my niche, and it was it was a very, very slow process, not saying I want to write for Runner's World tomorrow and I'm going to write them a bunch of letters. I actually started out, I started a blog. So Sweat Science initially started just as my own my own blog, just posting several times a week on interesting stuff. And I did that for a few years, maybe I can't remember exactly how long, maybe at least 3 years, just on my own, running the blog and gradually building a readership, because it turns out, I had guessed correctly that there is a pretty big audience of people who are interested in endurance and also interested in the details and the science and the evidence, and really are like getting into the nitty gritty, analyzing the nature of the evidence. So that built up slowly. And in the meantime, I was building up my journalism career more generally, like writing for actual magazines. And I ended up writing 1 or 2 pieces for Runner's World, just as a freelancer, before I moved my blog to there. And, the real secret is, or not the secret, but the real key was Amby Burfoot, who, is a former Boston Marathon champion and then was a long time editor of Runner's World. He's a really voracious consumer of running science and endurance science analysis. So he had come across my blog and was reading my blog and thought it was good. And we interacted a little bit, and he turned into a real mentor, because he's been an amazing running science journalist. And eventually he was the one who said to the powers that be at Runner's World, hey, you should get this guy Hutchinson on board, see if you can get his blog. So I moved the blog to Runner's World in 2012, and that immediately brought a bigger audience, and kind of more credibility and attention to the blog. The trade-off was that it had to focus a little more narrowly on running, whereas in its initial incarnation, it was a broader look at endurance and health and exercise. And so that I worked with Runner's World for 5 years, and it was really good. I had a lot of opportunities being with Runner's World and chance to go cover various interesting stories. But I decided last fall, I guess it was in September, I ended up going from Runner's World to Outside. And part of the motivation was, again, that I wanted to broaden back out a little bit to that there's a lot to say about running, but there's even more to say when you think broadly about the concept of endurance, which I think is applicable, not just in running, but in many sports, in many activities, and in sort of in life in general, in a way. So that's why that was sort of the rationale, or at least part of the rationale, that I wanted to broaden back out to this bigger field of view.
Yeah. Okay. Makes sense. And that also brings us to, I guess, the main reason why I invited you here on the show today, because you recently published your third book, which is called Endure: Mind, Body, and the Curiously Elastic Limits of Human Performance. It's been getting pretty good reviews by the endurance community. Where did that idea come from to write the book, and how long did it take you to get it published?
Yeah, it's been germinating for a long time. I've been trying to retrace when it actually started, and I know I was sending emails to people, in 2009 or early 2010, saying, "Hey, I'm working on a book about the limits of endurance, and so that's why I want to, come and visit your lab." So it's been at least 8 years that I've been nominally working on it. Of course, all this time I was also working as a journalist and paying the bills in other ways, so it wasn't full time. But so in a sense, the idea for the book really, again, dates back to what we were talking about earlier. My own running career, and walking away from it with a little bit with some dreams unrealized and some questions. Like, did I get everything out of myself? What were my limits? And what why could I have gone faster? And if so, how? And if not, why not? So I was always sort of wondering that. And I can't remember the exact moment the exact situation where I first came across Tim Noakes's research on the central governor. Like, when I was in high school, I got a copy of Tim Noakes's book, Lore of Running, in like 1991 or something, and I read it multiple times. Like, it was a real Bible to me. But at that point, he hadn't really developed this idea of the central governor, the idea that endurance isn't just a function of VO2 max and things like that, but actually your brain plays a key role in setting what feel like physical limits. And so at some point in, maybe 2006, 2007, in the course of writing other stuff about the science of exercise, and in particular, I think I may have come across some of his research on hydration, which was also challenging the idea that you slow down because your body doesn't have enough water. I came across his more general work on the idea of a central governor, and I think it really resonated with me because of because of my own experience as an athlete, where sometimes you felt like you were going all out and you were doing everything, and then something changed, or whatever, the next day or the next week you were a completely different runner without anything physical changing. That your performance really depended on, to some extent, on what was going on in your head. Even just the difference between doing a workout or doing a minor race and doing a big race. It was like I was a guy who had a very big differential between what I could run in training, what I could run in a small race, and what I could run in a big race. When things went well, I could do so much better in a big race. And so there was this sort of enduring mystery, like, what is it that determines why I can go this fast in some circumstances and only that fast in other circumstances? And is there something, could I go even faster if I was able to unlock that? So when I saw Tim Noakes's research, that really kind of, there was a feeling of like, oh, there are scientists who are actually looking at this thing that speak to my experience and maybe answer some of those questions. And so my initial thought was that I was going to write a book about, Tim Noakes's radical view of endurance. Except that as I got into it and started to dig deeper into the research, I realized it's not quite as straightforward. That some people disagreed with Noakes just because they didn't like Noakes, and some people disagreed with Noakes just because they had their own careers were tied up with more traditional views of exercise physiology. But some people also disagreed with Noakes because they had good reasons for raising questions about his theories, and they had alternate theories. And those as I got deeper, I found all these conflicting or competing views of the brain's role in endurance to be fascinating. And I realized I didn't just want to write a book about one man's opinion. So I ended up spending 8 years or whatever it was looking more broadly at the concept of endurance and the brain's role in endurance, and thinking of it not just in the context of running, but in the context of, I ended up defining endurance as the struggle to continue against a mounting desire to stop, which is, that's whether you're, doing your taxes or sitting through a long presentation at work, or whether you're running a marathon or wherever the case may be, there's these commonalities in the idea of trying to push beyond your limits or push beyond what you naturally want to do. So anyway, that's kind of where the book came from.
So can you maybe give some examples in how the brain might influence endurance and performance in endurance?
Yeah. So let me give a personal example, then a lab example. So the personal example that really sort of stuck with me is I spent a number of years trying to break 4 minutes for 1,500 meters. I ended up, through high school and early university, for about 4 years, I was running 4:01 and 4:02 over and over, couldn't break 4. So I really had the sense that, yes, there were actual physical limits and I was close to mine, and that if I got everything perfect, I might be able to run 3:59. And one day what happened is, at a really low-key meet, is that the timekeeper who was calling out splits was calling out the wrong splits. And so he was calling out fast splits, which made me think I was having like the day of my life, the best day of my life, because I felt easy and yet apparently I was going fast. And so after a couple of laps, I stopped listening to the splits and just said, "Don't waste this moment, Alex." And I just sort of went all out trying to get to the finish line. And I ended up running 3:52, which was a 9-second personal best after years of training. It it turned out this timekeeper must have started his watch late or had a translation problem or something, because he was actually about 3 seconds off with each lap, which is a lot over 200 meters. And then after that race, then my next, I'd been struggling to break 4 minutes, and it wasn't like I had that miracle race and then went back to struggling to break 4 minutes. Instead, I ran 3:49 the next race, 3:44 the race after that. And so all of a sudden I was a totally different runner. Some switch had been kind of flicked by deceiving myself. And so I got away from this idea that I'm a guy who might be able to run 3:59, and sort of I'd been focusing too much on the splits, and in a sense I must have been sort of self-limiting without even realizing it. So that was my personal experience that told me that it's not, the feeling that you can't go any farther or any faster is sometimes it's an illusion, because I'd felt, until the week before that race, I'd felt like 3:59 was impossible for me, and instead I was running 3:44 a few weeks later.
And in those next couple of races, were you using your splits as a tool, or were you just running by feel at that moment?
I was back to being aware of the splits, but in both of those races, it was a case where I'd gotten into good fields where there were people running fast. And it was actually, for those particular races, the motivation was more like, "Alex, you're going to be in last place. Don't get dropped. At least stay with the pack." And in both cases, I was in last place throughout both of those races until the 3/4 of the way through the race. And that's all I was focused on. So I wasn't worried about the splits. I was aware of them, but not worried about them. I was like, don't even worry about the splits. Just make sure you're not dropped off the back of the pack, because otherwise, the people in the B heat of the race are going to be really mad that someone got placed in the A heat when he didn't deserve to be there. Mm-hmm. And then, as it turned out, I got to 3/4, like, oh, actually, I feel okay, and I was able to pass, half or more of the field in the last lap of the race. But it's not. It's not necessarily so much that you should never pay attention to your splits or anything like that, but it's if you build up this idea of what splits you're capable of. So in those subsequent 2 races, I was no longer thinking I'm only capable of X, or I'm only, this is how fast I can run. I was more with the attitude of, I want to know what my splits are, but don't worry, don't let them slow me down, because I don't know what I'm capable of anymore. I no longer have this preconceived notion of what's possible for me. Mm-hmm. And of course, it comes back after a while. I was a 3:42 guy, and so I was always thinking, oh, can I run 59s? Can I run 58s per lap or whatever? One important thing to note is that it's not like there was some magic switch that I could then bottle and reuse every week. There was some magic that happened in those few weeks, but it's a very, just because quote unquote limits are in your head doesn't mean you can just change them, or that they feel any less real in a race. It's still your brain is still part of your body, and so it's still hard to counteract those limits.
Yeah, so your brain definitely can help you push through a certain limit, but at a certain point you're gonna bump against your physical limits. Is that correct?
Yeah, and even if it's your brain, your brain may be holding you back or pushing you forward, but it's not enough to just decide that you're going to go harder or go faster. Because even if you say I'm just going to keep going. I'm going to ignore my brain. Well, you're gonna say to yourself, oh, yeah, I tried, but I ran into a wall and I really couldn't go any faster. Well, it's like if a lion jumped out from behind a tree and started chasing you, you would discover that your muscles still were capable of going faster. Your brain is more powerful than your desire in most cases. So, and that's why for me it wasn't that magic moment wasn't just that I decided to try harder. There was some deception in I was kind of inadvertently tricked. And some of them, if you go to the lab and try and reproduce some of these things, some of the most compelling examples or compelling demonstrations of the brain's role are exactly that. They involve people being tricked. So, you put a cyclist in a heat chamber to see how fast they can go under hot conditions. Well, if you change the setting on the thermometer so that even though it's actually 32 degrees, the thermometer just says 25 degrees, the cyclists can go faster than they would if the thermometer was correct. Now, that doesn't mean that heat isn't real or doesn't have real physiological effects on your body, but part of our response to something like heat is generated by the expectation that we're going to have to go slower and the perception that creates that you're feeling too hot, too uncomfortable. And you can do experiments with, clocks that run fast or run slow or misleading feedback. The problem is, and these are really interesting for demonstrations of the brain's role in endurance, but it's not something you can really apply easily in real life. It's like if you decide you don't want to be late for meetings anymore, so you set your watch to run 5 minutes fast. It works for a few days maybe or a week, but after a while you know that the clock is running fast, and so you just recalibrate your expectations. And it's the same, like you can have a coach who tells you, okay, and this is one of the Amby Burfoot, again, who I mentioned earlier, one of the things he said is, the greatest running workout you could possibly do is 5 times a mile as hard as you can. And then when you're done, your coach says, okay, get up and do another one. And you discover that you can do it, but you can't replicate that over and over again because sooner or later you start to expect it. And so it's a really interesting way of demonstrating the power of the brain. But it's not like an instant fix that you can say, okay, I just need to trick myself during every race and then I'm going to be able to, or during every workout, and then I'm going to be able to push myself back. So there's a kind of, the hard gap is, okay, we can convince ourselves that the brain is really important, but then the trickier thing is how do we take advantage of that? How do we actually use it?
Yeah. So can you maybe share a couple of tips for us? Yeah, that's the Weekend Warriors, the stuff that we can maybe use to improve our performance.
Yeah. So, one of the things that probably the biggest takeaway that I got from the people I spoke to in the research I did for the book was the importance of the internal monologue in your head, that the words that you say to yourself in the middle of a race or in situations of stress. And, the idea of motivational self-talk is old. Like sports psychologists have been talking about it for a long time. And we had a sports psychologist when I was in university who worked with the track team and tried to teach us some of these sorts of techniques, but we all just thought it was ridiculous. We were worried about our VO2 max and our lactate threshold, not about negative thought stopping. But this is one of the things that in this sort of new wave of research about the brain's role in endurance, people have been testing some of these ideas and finding that some of them really have powerful effects. And so there have been studies showing that if you do some fairly simple self-talk training. So, for example, there's always words going through your head during any stressful situation, whether it's a race or whether it's a presentation at work or whatever. And you may be telling yourself, oh, this hurts so much. I don't think I can make it. That other guy looks so strong, and that affects the way that doesn't change, the lactate levels in your legs or your heartbeat, but it affects how your brain interprets those signals. If you're telling yourself that it's hard and that you can't do it, then your brain is going to sort of integrate this information from the rest of your body and conclude, yeah, this effort must be too high. You probably should slow down. And so if the first step is if you can identify what it is you say to yourself in a race or in a hard workout, and then you can stop and take some time to think of alternatives. What other kinds of things could you say to yourself that are reasonable, that are not, there's no point in saying you're just to yourself, I'm invincible and I can fly and I'm going to run the last kilometer in 2 minutes flat, because that's not going to happen. But if you can say things to yourself that are, well supported and justified, but encouraging, like, you've done the training, you're ready for this. You've done the training, you're ready for this. Push through this, you can do it. As cheesy as it sounds, there have been several studies recently that find that this does indeed, just some basic, and then you practice those techniques, and then in a race you're able to push harder and improve your endurance time. And interestingly, what they found is this may sound like a big placebo effect, but they found that you actually, after self-taught training, you're able to push deeper into your physiological reserves. So they find if you take self-taught training and then do an endurance, like a cycling race in a heat chamber, you're able to push your core temperature higher by about 0.5 degrees. So by changing the words in your head, you've actually enabled yourself to dig a little bit deeper into those physical reserves.
Okay. Yeah, I've been watching a lot of the Winter Olympics recently, and you see a lot of athletes there using visualization techniques, bobsleigh drivers and slalom skiers and stuff like that, trying to visualize the course. Is this something that endurance athletes can use as well? Like, for example, I think it's really hard to go and visualize a 10-hour Ironman event, but you think it would be useful to, during the last couple of 100 meters of your swim, start visualizing the way you're going to do your transition, for example?
Yeah, and I think, this gets into stuff where it's there's not as much research in this area, but if you talk to athletes and talk to sports psychologists, there's a lot of belief that this is really powerful and helps. And I think one of the things, for an endurance athlete, it's not so much visualizing, necessarily the physical motion. Like a bobsled driver, you see them like twisting back and forth, visualizing each of the 4 turns. Well, it's like, if you're running a track race, you're just going to turn left 4 times every lap. It's not complicated. That's not the challenge. But I think one of the things that every endurance athlete has to prepare for is the moment, or most likely the multiple moments during a race, where the effort and discomfort feel overwhelming, and you're confronted with the challenge to stop, or in a competitive situation where a rival starts to pull away from you and you feel like you can't go with them, and your brain is going to be very, very persuasive at trying to tell you, that's it, you did your best, but you failed, and now you should stop, you should give up, it's over, you should give up, stop, slow down. And so you need to visualize those moments of truth, of decision, so that at least, well, I don't know if you need to, but I think it's a powerful technique to be prepared for those moments, to visualize both the worst moments and the best moments, and to understand how you're going to respond, to practice that response, to see yourself on the ropes, having trouble and overcoming that, and saying, okay, so when that moment comes that I feel like I can't go on, that I feel like the pace was too high, what am I going to say to myself? How am I going to respond? What am I going to think in my head that's going to help me stay motivated to do that? What is the justification? Because I think, your mentality during a race is always, it's like a different world. It's like a different you, and your brain plays tricks on you. And it's always easy to be convinced that it's not possible. And so you have to kind of live that moment in advance, so that when the real moment comes, you're not caught by surprise at how unpleasant it is or how powerful the desire to slow down is. You're ready for it, and you can fall back on the rehearsals you've done mentally.
Yeah. Okay. Looking back at running, we've got a world record of 9 seconds and 56 100ths of a second by Usain Bolt at the 100 meters. We've got a 2 hour and 24 second marathon by Eliud Kipchoge at the Breaking 2 project. And we've got some pretty solid other world records in the middle distances. With everything that you found out doing the research for the book, do you think we're still far from the actual limits of human performance at this moment?
Yeah, it's a tricky question. One comparison that I think is interesting to consider is between human records and horse racing records. For a long time, humans and horses were both getting faster at roughly similar rates. And starting sometime around the 1950s, depending on how you analyze it, the horse racing records started to level off. So if you look at big races like the Kentucky Derby, the record is actually still from 1973. Secretariat ran 159.4, I think it was. And horses there's a lot of money in horse racing, but horses aren't getting faster, even though in theory, nutrition and training techniques and physiological knowledge are getting better. Human records have continued to progress since the 1950s, of course. And so what's the difference? I mean, there may be many differences, but I think the key difference in this case is that humans can sort of harness that power of belief and from prior actions. So if someone runs 109.59, you know that it's humanly possible to run 9.58. And if Kipchoge runs 2 flat 25, then you know that a human can run 2 flat 24. And so I think that helps to frame the competition as each new generation of, great outlier athletes come along. They're not just competing against themselves or against each other the way a horse has to. The horse can only compete against himself or herself and the competitors on that day. Humans are always competing against kind of all of history, and that helps to shape their expectations and the way they train and the way they prepare. So I think that's kind of one of the reasons I think records will continue to edge downwards, because there's always there's always outliers, and they're always able to compete against the greatest that have ever been. Now, if you compare the 100 meters and the marathon, my instinct is that the 100 meters is closer to its sort of biomechanical limits than the marathon, if only because every great 100-meter runner gets, a dozen chances to run as fast as possible every year and may have a career that lasts for a number of years, whereas the greatest marathoners tend to have 2 shots a year usually, and then sometimes one of those opportunities is derailed because they're running at the Olympics under really hot or bad conditions, or even at another race they choose to run Boston, which isn't record eligible, or it's too hot, or it's raining like it was in Berlin last fall. So the greatest marathoners, you have to get very lucky to get a good day and to have everything go right. So I think there's kind of more fat on the bone for the marathon record to come down. But just as a counter argument to myself, I would say, well, Usain Bolt took the most mature record and one that was, almost certainly affected by drugs before he even came on the scene, and he took it down by something like 1.5% over the course of 2 years. So, all of which is to say that predictions sometimes go out the window when a remarkable individual comes along. And not to get too far afield, but one of the points that a friend of mine, David Epstein, who wrote The Sports Gene, a point that he makes is Usain Bolt is this physiological freak, and in almost anywhere in the world other than Jamaica, he would not have been playing. He would not have been a 100-meter runner. He would have, he's tall. He's not a classical sprinter. He would have been a soccer player. He would have been a football player. He would have been something other than a sprinter. But he was a freak. He happened to be born in Jamaica, and so he ended up as a sprinter, and he dropped the record dramatically. So, kind of the future of records in some ways depends on what populations are interested in the sport, and in terms of heightening our chances of finding the next freak, because there's always a next freak, but we just don't know if he or she will end up participating in the sport that he or she was born to participate in.
Yeah, so it definitely take a special individual. That's for sure. All right, Alex, thanks for your time. Much appreciated. How can people get in touch with you if they want to?
Probably the easiest way to find me is on Twitter. My handle there is Sweat Science, and anytime I write a new article, I post it there, and I respond to messages there too. My website is alexhutchinson.net, and there you can find some more older articles and some background information, and of course links to the book and things like that. Yeah,
I guess that's available on Amazon and all the major online retailers.
Yeah, it should be available wherever bookstores are sold. There are some foreign translations in the works, so hopefully if it's not available yet, it'll be available in whatever country you may be listening from before too long.
All right, cool. One final question to finish it off. If you could sit on a bench and chat for an hour with someone from the past or the present, who would it be and why?
That's an interesting one. For me, I think the guy would be Roger Bannister. He was such a barrier-breaking runner, and I thought his autobiography is really the one he wrote right after his 4-minute mile in 1954. It's very thoughtful, and as sport gets more complicated these days with drugs and cheating, I find myself a little more and more in sympathy with his. He kind of lamented the professionalization of sport, which of course is it's been great in some ways, but I'd love to chat with him about what sport meant to him and how he sees sport, where he thinks sport should go, in the modern world and in the future.
Yeah, nice. I think that'll be an interesting chat. Thanks for your time, Alex. Much appreciated.
Thanks, Peter. I really enjoyed the conversation.
All right, junkies, you've reached the end of yet another episode of the Endurance Junkie podcast. Thanks for listening, and thanks to Alex Hutchinson for coming on. Now, every listen means a lot to me, so if you like this interview and think someone else would too, feel free to share it on your own social media channels, and that would be awesome, and I very much appreciate it. And if you have suggestions for possible future guests, just shoot me an email to peter@junkiepodcast.com, and I'll try to make it happen. All right, thanks again for listening, and I hope you'll join me next time. Cheers.